God is not so much interested in our strategies and our techniques. I think he's more interested in our recognition of our dependence on him. And I took this application from a story in Genesis chapter 30. It's a story of Jacob. Jacob had left his home and he had gone north to his relative Laban. And Laban had been really prosperous since Jacob had come to live with him. And Jacob admitted and he recognized that Laban's prosperity was a blessing from God, and that all the success that Jacob had brought to his house was a result of God being with him. When Jacob was thinking about leaving Laban's house and going back down south to Canaan, naturally Laban wanted him to stay because he wanted to continue to receive the overflow of the blessing that God was giving to Jacob. So he struck this deal with Jacob, and that was that if he stayed, Jacob could have all of the striped and spotted sheep and goats and all the black lambs of Laban's household. And if Jacob ever decided to leave, those particular animals would belong to Jacob. And so Jacob agrees to stay for a little bit longer, and he begins this really interesting selective breeding process to produce more spotted and striped lambs and goats. He took striped sticks and he put these striped sticks in front of the sheep when they were breeding. And according to my research and my understanding of this passage, a lot of the ancients thought that whatever the sheep were looking at when they were breeding, that would affect the offspring that they produced. So if they were looking at striped sticks, they would produce, well, perhaps striped offspring. And wouldn't you know it, after a while, this breeding strategy worked, and there were more striped and spotted animals being produced every single day. Jacob also used some other strategies, some similar and some a little bit different, but what we know is that the end result was that Jacob became very rich and his animals grew and grew and grew, and Laban's animals were not nearly as successful. Okay, so knowing what we know now about breeding and genetics, we know that there's not any significant connection between sheep or goats staring at sticks when they're breeding and the outcome of their offspring. God blessed Jacob even though his science wasn't up to date, even though his techniques were not the most modern and not the most correct. And why did God do that? Why didn't he correct his science or tell him the way that things needed to be done? Why did he bless him even through his ignorance? Well, I think it's probably because to God, it's not a top priority that his disciples have the most bleeding edge strategies that align with all the newest science, all the new cultural statistics, and that account for all the latest studies in human psychology. What's important to God is that the people who are doing the work sense their dependence on him and give him the glory for any success that they've had in the past and for any success that they'll have in the future. And I think one of the lessons that we can take away from that is perhaps we should spend less time relying on our own ingenuity and cleverness and strategy when it comes to multiplying the flock of God, or the church, and more time in prayer and in recognition of the necessity of God's power to work through our insufficiency.